Well, today, Colton Burpo is 13 years old, and like many kids his age, he goes to school, plays sports. But unlike his peers, Colton has a story that's been heard around the world, a story that began 10 years ago when he almost died.
Looking at Colton Burpo now, you would never guess that he almost died in 2003. His father, Todd, tells about Colton's near-death experience in the New York Times best-selling book, Heaven is for Real.
He started throwing up into the toilet, and at first we're like, okay, he's got the stomach flu, because the doctor said it was going around.
As days passed, Colton's condition only got worse. Then his doctor discovered his appendix had burst. An infection was spreading throughout his body. Time was running out.
Someone came to us and started talking to us that we got to have surgery on your kid.
It was tough. Seeing your boy be lifeless when he was a very vibrant child.
And it was at that moment that we were looking at each other. I remember my wife holding Colton in that hallway, just us. He's not even moving. We went to the surgery prep area, and I remember them hauling him away and him just yelling at me, "Daddy, don't let him take me. Daddy, don't let him take me."
For the rest of this story, joining us is the Burpo family. Todd, Sonia, and Colton, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Colton, at what point in time did you know that you were really sort of in trouble? Was it when you were getting wheeled away from your dad?
Well, I just didn't like... I'm not sure when I was actually in trouble. I just didn't like getting poked with needles, so...
I don't either.
No, that's not a good thing.
You say angels and Jesus came to you and took you to heaven. Did they just show up in the operating room?
Actually, Jesus showed up first, and he helped calm me down because I was scared at first. I wasn't sure what was happening. Then he had the angels sing to me, and that calmed me down.
What did they say?
Well, they sang Jesus Loves Me, Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho. Those were my favorite songs at the time, but...
So they sang to you songs that you had learned in church?
Yes.
I find that pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be a recurring theme in this whole journey, how much both Jesus and God the Father tried to calm you and reassure you that everything was okay. When you went to the throne room, because that was the next spot, what did God do for you?
Well, God, he was just there. He was just a being that radiated love. And even though he's so big, you're not scared of him because he loves you so much. And what he did is he helped make heaven be a happy place.
That's a good way to put it. What do you remember most about seeing Jesus?
Well, I probably remember that I spent a lot of time with him. A majority of the time I was in heaven, I was with Jesus.
What do you remember about his eyes?
Well, his eyes, they were unlike any other that I've seen. They were just sparkling.
What do you mean by that? Light coming out of them? Or?
Well, it's hard to describe because there's no words that we have that can describe just how beautiful his eyes are.
When you left the hospital, what did you see as you were leaving?
When I left the hospital, the angels, one of them took me and flew me up to heaven. But I could see down, and I could see my dad and my mom, and they were both in separate rooms having separate conversations.
With who?
Well, they were both praying to God, seeing it, making sure that I would come out of the operation.
All right. Sonia, you're sort of the untold story the first time in the book, and now you're coming out with, what were you praying at that moment when he was in the operating room?
That he would come back. We knew he was very, very sick, and I also was on my cell phone trying to get him on every prayer chain possible because I believed in the power of prayer, and I knew we were at a point we needed to sound the alarm and get as many people praying.
What was going on with you when the doctor was talking about how can we get him to another medical facility? This is happening, and you're wondering, am I getting ready to lose my child?
Yeah, it was hard to see him in that point because he was a very vibrant boy, and just to see him just lay there and not respond to toys, friends, food, anything that way he would normally respond to, and just to see your boy like that was very devastating. But you knew you had to make some decisions and do some things, so you had to kind of put your emotions to the side and decide how can we make this happen, and then also pray.
Well, what got you to the point where you said, okay, I've got to put things in motion. I've got to get him on prayer chains. I've got to get a lot of prayer going here. For a lot of people, when these overwhelming events happen, there's a tendency to just want to shut down. Mm-hmm. But you got up and got into action. Why?
I don't. Yeah, you can shut down, but we, like Todd and I both agree, he wasn't gone yet, and so we still had time, and time was on our side. And I come from a pastor's family, so I was, of course, calling my dad and calling my brother, and just calling every prayer chain we could put him on, and just sound the alarm and get as many people, because when one or two are gathered together, I wanted more than that, because we knew we're desperate.
You wanted thousands.
Yes.
Not just one or two. You wanted thousands. All right, Todd. What was your prayer? What were you praying at this time?
Well, it was desperate. I think for me, having the role of pastor, dad, husband, I didn't want my boy to know how afraid I was. I wanted to be strong for my wife, and yet everything inside me at that moment, especially with him screaming for me to protect him and me to do something, and I couldn't do anything. I was looking for a place to hide before I could shut the door, pull the curtains. And when I prayed in that room, it wasn't a prayer that was pastoral. I didn't pray scripture. I was mad. I was upset. I was God. The only thing I could think of is when David was pleading for the life of his son. My son's not gone yet, and I need you now. And it's probably the most honest prayer I've ever prayed in my life. And I think some people have asked me, because Colton shared later, Dad, the reason why Jesus sent me back is he was answering your prayer. And people have asked me, why did God answer your prayer? And all I can say is that's the most honest prayer I've ever prayed in my life. I mean, there was completely no role playing. I was just a dad that was desperate. And I think when we get in circumstances in life that are crisis, we all want to run. The question is, am I going to run away from God or run to God at that moment? And I would just run into him with everything I had. I just got to have you show up now.
Yeah, I know for me, my daughter went through surgery. It wasn't as dramatic as what happened to you, but it was probably the hardest thing. Yeah. To see her rolled away on a gurney, and wonder, is she gonna come back? Yeah. And where do you go with that? Yeah, it's not a time for a polished prayer. No, it's not. You're not in pastor mode. No, you're in God. I need you now, and I need you to show up now. Yeah. What was the first thing that got you going, Todd? That something significant happened?
Well, when we were driving back through North Platte, we finally had maybe healed from the experience enough to kind of joke about it. We said, Colton, do you want to go back to the hospital? And he goes, oh no, send Cassie. He offered up his big sister pretty quick, which we expected that. But he said, but Dad, while I was there, the angels sang to me. And angels are not something that we discuss very often. Now, we have Bible stories in church, read Bible lessons, we talk about Jesus all the time, but angels, that totally was a very rarely talked about subject. You talk about angels maybe at Christmas time, the nativity story, but when he said they sang to him and he was very definite, that's what captured our attention, and we're like, okay, what did we miss? And then he said, well, Dad, Jesus had the angels sing to me. And then when we asked him, well, where was Jesus? He's like, well, Dad, I was sitting on his lap. And that's where I was shocked. I'm like, well, how do you know that? And then when he started saying, well, Dad, I could see you, and then he started taking over the conversation. And then he talked to me about me being in that room all by myself. My wife at that moment didn't know where I was. Matter of fact, I'd slipped away. And when I came back to her and brought my stuff back, she was mad at me, like, where have you been? I've been out here all by myself. You haven't been around me. And her cell phone battery was about out, so can I use your phone? I never told her where I was. You don't brag about prayers like that, even to your wife. And then all of a sudden, here's my son. Dad, I saw you.
Yeah, I saw you. And it was that desperate prayer.
It was.
When did you figure out that this wasn't just Jesus coming into the hospital room?
Well,
but this was something a whole lot more.
This is about a week later. We went to the trip to Sonia's brother's house, and we come back, and I wanted to go there because when he said he saw Jesus, you know, it was just burning in my mind. What did he look like? And so I started asking some questions, and again, Colton's a typical boy. Sometimes he wants to talk, sometimes he wants to play, but then all of a sudden he would just take over. I said, Colton, remember you said you saw Jesus? He goes, yeah. And all of a sudden he looks up at me and says, Dad, do you know Jesus' cousin baptized him? I go, well, yeah. Well, I saw him, and he's really nice. And then, do you know Jesus has a horse? And then he starts going on, and pretty soon this conversation just took off before I knew it. And then all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute, you said you were in the hospital with Jesus, and wait a minute, did you go to heaven? He's like, oh yeah, I did, Dad. And that's when I first dawned on me that that's what happened.
And I imagine a whole bunch of biblical passages started popping into your mind with each one of his statements. You're going,
oh yeah,
how would he know that?
Exactly, and he would confirm stuff, you know, and being a pastor and knowing what was in the Bible and knowing what my preschool curriculum teaches and how he was going so much further beyond that, you're just like, okay, this didn't come from home, this didn't come from church, and it obviously came from something he experienced.
Well, Colton, something else came where you met a sister you had never met before. Tell us about that.
Well, she actually met me at the gates of heaven. She just ran out and hugged me. At first I was like, who are you? And then she told me who she was. But back when I was 3, I didn't like hugs, so...
Do you like hugs today?
Kind of gone into it more, but...
Not so much.
No.
Not so much. So she comes out and hugs you. How'd you know it was your sister?
Well, actually, she's the one that told me who she was. Mm-hmm. I had no idea who she was.
Who else did you meet?
I met my great-grandpa, Pop, and then I also met King David, Samson, the apostles Peter and John, and Mary.
Wow. You got quite a tour. How long were you there?
Well, I'm not too sure how long, but when I came back to Earth, I told my dad I was up there for 3 minutes. There's no way I could have saw that in 3 minutes.
So time sort of changes. Yeah. You know, the time that's passing here in a hospital room is different than the time that's passing in heaven. Yeah. Sonia, let me ask you, who is this sister?
Between Cassie and Colton, we miscarried a baby. We didn't know it was daughter. We hadn't told the kids because how do you tell anybody you had a miscarriage? You know, or a T-shirt that said I just had a miscarriage. And so when he told us that he had 2 sisters, it gave us such a healing. We never we thought we'd gotten over it. But we still had that hurt, and this has provided some healing and some, she's okay, and it's a she.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's ever anything you get over. My mother miscarried before me, and actually had gotten to the point where they had named the baby. Yeah. Curiously, if there hadn't been a miscarriage, I wouldn't be here. So I'm really encouraged that I'm going to meet James Gordon one day. And
at the gate.
At the gate. He's going to come out and give me a hug, which is really nice. Yeah. What did Pop look like?
Well, Pop, when I saw him, he was a young man in his late 20s, early 30s. That's what everybody looks like in heaven. But...
I'm liking that.
Yeah. So you look like your young self.
But you met children, too.
Yeah.
You know, are they going to grow older? Are they?
Yes. Like, if you were miscarried or if you died as a kid, what you do is you will still grow to your prime. But then once you hit your late 20s, early 30s, you stop and you stay at that age.
Okay. Todd, how did you know he had actually met Pop?
Well, I would take Pop, you know, when I was a little kid, we were so close. He started telling me about things I did with Pop when I was a kid and how nice Pop was. But when he could talk about things I did with Pop, I was like, how do you know that? Well, Pop told me. So I'd take him to pictures because I wanted to get a description of Pop, and he couldn't recognize him as the Pop that I knew at 61. But it finally dawned on me with the descriptions he gave us of his sister, how she looked a lot like Cassie, but not quite as big. It was like, well, that's what I'd expect her to look like this side of heaven, except with wings. But so eventually I said, okay, Mom, do you happen to have a picture of Pop as a young man? So she sent me one, and this took a while to get it. I just hand Colton the picture. And I had never at any time, had he ever seen this. This picture was one that was put up in a closet before he was born. I just said, Colton, take a look at this. And it's a family picture. We have it in the book. And without even hesitating, Colton just stops and goes, hey, how did you get a picture of Pop? Right off, just like that. Wow. Now, there's no drugs, no teacher, nothing that could have spurred that memory. The only thing that could have answered it is he saw him.
Well, Colton, Sonia, Todd, thanks. Thanks for your story.
Thank you.
All right.
Randy Hicks has died twice. The first time he overdosed and doctors pulled the white sheet up over his head. The second time, Randy overdosed again. And that's when he says demons started pulling him to hell.
Throughout his life, Randy Hicks' drug addiction has cost him a lot. His military career, his freedom, and his family. But when he came face to face with death, he realized there was much more at stake.
My body collapsed to the ground. I felt something physically dragging me out of my body. And I mean, I looked up and I saw death and I saw hell in his eyes.
Randy describes his experience on the edge of hell.
Well, Randy Hicks joins us for the rest of his story. Randy, it's great to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Terry.
Talk a little bit about your beginnings. You really were introduced to drugs at a very young age.
Yeah, I had walked out into the garage at my mom and dad's house. My brothers were users. And so I just seen them using a large bong. I didn't know it was a bong at the time. I just know they were smoking out of it. I was interested. They offered it.
How old were you at the time?
Oh, I was about 8 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Grade school. The curious age.
Yeah, and it just kind of progressed from there. Tell me about, you've died twice. Tell me about the first time you died.
The first time I died, I didn't realize I was dying. I was actually on the bed. They had pulled the covers up on me, and I didn't know that till the next morning. I'd woke up and looked at a sheet. They had, you know, I was moving underneath it. I realized I was strapped in. They had these leather straps on my arms and hands. They had me strapped down, and I was moving. The next thing I know, all these doctors are looking around me. They're just a look on their face, you know. They were like, what are you doing? You're moving.
And what happened? Yeah, were you conscious after you died at that point or stopped breathing? What did you experience during that?
During that time, there was really nothing.
Just a darkness.
Yeah, just a darkness. I didn't realize I had died till the next day, till they told me. And the doctor told me my mother was outside the room all night praying for me in the name of Jesus. He said all we could hear was that name, Jesus.
You know, for a lot of people, having a near-death experience like that would have been a wake-up call. But you wound up going right back into using again.
Yes.
Right back into the lifestyle that you'd had before.
Yes.
And then down the road, you experienced another death experience. Tell us what happened.
Well, what had happened was, after the first time, they had told me that I should have died. It was the prayers of my mother. I believe God made very clear. It scared me enough to get me in church, you know, to sit in church, to make sure I was there every Sunday, heard the word, just never allowed the word to get in me. Yeah. But at the same time, I never totally gave my life to Christ because peer pressure. Always had friends still calling you, you know, you get saved, you got to change everything, your life, your friends, everything. God wants all of us, not some of us. And I didn't give him all of me. Yeah. And so I played the game. I was satisfied my flesh, not my spirit. I didn't satisfy God. I was satisfying people.
Did you feel guilty?
No.
Yeah, you were just doing your thing.
Yeah, because I had both going at the same time.
So then what happened?
Well, one day I was going through my mother's house and walking through a middle bedroom, everything just went black. And I dropped on the ground. My body fell. I remember my hands going into the ground. Fear filled the room. I mean, Terry, it was so strong that I could feel my flesh shaking on my bones.
You were high at the time, right?
No, I was straight. I was straight. I had not used that morning. I was going to go out that night and party. And it just, the drugs built up over time that my heart couldn't take no more. But my flesh was shaking so bad, and it was just a fear, and I could feel my body leaving. I mean, it was like, you know how the Bible talks about you're a spirit man? Well, I got a revelation of that because I was halfway out of my body, and I knew I was halfway out. When I looked down, I could see my flesh and my hands in the ground crying out for Jesus, because I immediately started begging God. I said, Jesus, save me, forgive me, don't let me go to hell. I mean, everything was in me was not letting go of that carpet, but I was still getting pulled out. And I looked up behind me, and there it was. It was a huge skull. I call it a darkness within a darkness, because it's like you have darkness, but then there is a living darkness. It had power. It had authority over me because it was dragging me out. It was this huge skull-looking thing. It had these curled horns like a ram, but it had authority over me because I didn't have Jesus Christ. You know?
What made you cry out for help? I mean, here you'd been at church. You'd been hearing the word, whether you'd applied it to your life or not.
Well, you know, I think sometimes things happen in our life that can scare us in the church, but we really don't commit and submit to God. But this time, I knew if I didn't cry out and got real, I was going to hell. And so I cried out seriously and sincerely, and I begged God, and I wept. And a peace, when I called on that name Jesus, Terry, it was so unbelievable, the peace. It was so perfect. It was not earthly. It was beautiful. It's like everything was all right. Don't worry about nothing. And it felt like an angel would pick me up. And I turned and looked toward the door. It's like he turned my head toward the door. And when I did, my door, I could see a long, glorious white robe in a hand. I mean, it was whiter than any white. It was not earthly. It was glorious. It was, how can I describe it? Powerful. It was peaceful. It was saying, everything's all right. Don't worry about it. I got you. You called on my name. I was right here.
How'd your life change after that?
Oh, I went to church. I sung the songs, except this time I was reading my Bible. I was listening to what he said. I was asking God to help me live it out in my life, to help me to understand it.
You entered into the relationship.
Oh, yes. I pursued God, reckless abandonment. I pursued God with everything within me.
You know, I love the scripture that says, you'll find me when you search for me with all of your heart. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Terry, for having me.
What a story you have to share. Five years ago, Jeffrey Thompson had routine surgery, but something went wrong. Jeff's heart went out, and he died in the arms of his wife.
I began having stomach pains, severe stomach pains, that initially, I just had no idea what it was.
The stress Jeffrey Thompson was under running his law practice had taken a toll on his body.
I maintained that stress, and it continued to work on me, and it also continued to work on my body. And eventually it broke down.
Jeffrey developed diverticulitis and needed surgery to remove part of his intestine. But after the operation, his body continued to hemorrhage.
And then I looked into the surgeon's eyes, and I could see concern on his face. My internal clock told me that I was getting ready to die, and I only had a few seconds of consciousness left. I reached up to grab my wife. I was just wanting to tell her how much I loved her and tell her that I was getting ready to leave her.
And I went to him, and it was right after that I lost him. You know, I could tell he left. He took my hand and then he was gone.
Jeff Thompson joins us now live, thankfully, for the rest of his story. Jeff, it's great to have you with us.
Terry, honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can we go kind of back to the beginning,
Sure.
first of all, and set the stage here? You were a very successful lawyer. You were working 70 to 80 hours a week.
Correct.
And it eventually took a toll on your body. Tell us about that.
Well, it did. You know, my practice, it takes us around the country. I'm fortunate. I'm with a wonderful firm, and we have clients in every state, which requires a lot of travel. And as you probably know, it takes it out of you. And over time, it broke my body down, unfortunately.
So here you are. You're going into this surgery for a stomach issue.
Right.
Nothing that should have been fatal. Were you prepared for anything bad to happen? Or?
Well, I was not. I will tell you, my wife and I had a feeling that something was going to happen. I will tell you that, but obviously nothing like that. I had told my assistant on the way out the door the day before surgery, tell my clients I'm up and running Monday. Wow. Well, that was my idea. That wasn't God's, obviously.
Well, sometimes God sends an earthquake, doesn't he, to kind of get our attention.
Exactly.
So here you are. You have the surgery.
Yeah.
The surgery itself, the correction actually took place, but
Yes.
24 hours later, the doctors pulled back the sheet in your hospital room. Your vital signs were not good. And what did they find?
Well, I looked like I was pregnant, and what they had found is that I had been bleeding internally, and apparently for some time, and I literally looked pregnant. When I looked down, I realized immediately something was terribly wrong.
Tell me what happened then, because you said as you went into this blackout that we just heard described, that your senses were heightened, that the room became very different than it was when you were conscious. Tell us exactly what happened.
Well, right as I looked down at my stomach, I began to die, and my sensations from my extremities began to leave me, and I knew what was happening.
You were conscious of it.
I was conscious. I knew I only had a few seconds left of consciousness, and I reached up, grabbed my wife, and I wanted to tell her one more time how much I loved her.
Yeah.
She's an incredible person.
It's hard at those points, yes.
And I began to rise out of my body up into that room. And I knew what was happening. I have never been more alive.
Were you afraid?
No. That was the incredible thing. I have never felt such peace and such love. Wow. As I rose up into that room, I could see everything down below me that was occurring. And of all the profound things I could have thought or said, I said, this is very interesting. Leave it to a lawyer.
Leave it to a lawyer, I was just going to say.
Well, I got to the top of the room, and I was looking down below me, watching everything in complete peace. And then that's when the light entered.
And tell us about that.
It began at the ceiling, Terry, and it began to filter out into the room. And I tell you, I struggle for the words to describe the beauty and the warmth of that light. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The only thing I could compare it to is when you wake up in the morning and you see the sun's rays coming through and you know God's there. Multiply it times 1,000, and that's what I experienced. Wow. Incredible. And as it began to filter into that room and hit objects, colors came flooding out of them like I've never seen. And at that time, my senses became enhanced.
And what were you thinking at this point?
Well, I was absorbing it all. Yeah. I was enjoying it. I was in complete peace and comfort. I was overwhelmed by what was happening to me. But there was no pain and there was no fear.
Wow.
There was nothing but sweetness.
Where were you at spiritually at this point in your life?
I had been a Christian since I was a teenager, and I loved God, and you know, went to church, and went to Sunday school, helped teach Sunday school. I've had a love for God for a long time, but I tell you, I never understood how much He loved me until this happened.
Wow.
I'd been told all about it. I'd read it, but I never truly understood it.
So suddenly you're in the presence of what you're sensing is God Himself. Right. And what did that do to you? What did that do to you as a person, as a Christian?
Well, at the moment, it overwhelmed me. Had I had a body, I would have gone to the floor. I can tell you there's nothing like having God poured into your soul. Wow. And that's what happens. He poured into my very soul, and I was overwhelmed by it.
So you're in this amazing place, and you're feeling and seeing everything in extremes, and it's beautiful and peaceful. How did you wind up going back into your body?
Well, during this process, God infused a number of things into me, a number of thoughts, a number of things. But I had a fleeting thought, Terry, and that fleeting thought was, well, what about Madeline, my wife? And what about my son? Yeah. And it was a fleeting thought, which is unusual. I love them so dearly, but I wanted to be with God. But I had that fleeting thought, and that's when God said, you're going to go back.
And what did you feel then?
Well, the most immediate thing that happened was everything stopped below me. When I asked, well, what about Madeline and Will, everything stopped. It was as if someone put a pause button on a television. And everything stopped, and everything went silent. It was complete peace. And then he said, you're going to go back. Now, he infused things into me, and then I shot back in my body like I'd been hit by a lightning bolt. And I remember jolting in the bed and looking up, and the doctor was standing over saying, I'm losing him, I'm losing him. I've got to get him back in surgery, but I've got to get consent. How am I going to get consent? And then he shook his head, and he turned to my wife and said, you can give consent. And then I blacked out.
Wow.
And then it was 10 hours later I woke up for my second surgery.
You talked about God infusing things into you, Jeff.
Yes.
What do you feel God spoke to your
Well,
heart?
there were several things, and Terry, the first one is, and please, anyone that happens to be listening, God loves you more than you've ever known. He loves you beyond anything you've ever known. And if we fully understood the love that he has for us, I'm telling you, we would wake up with different priorities. Terry, I used to wake up with a knot in my stomach, and I wake up with joy in my heart. And the second thing was, and I said this, I have got to become a better person. And now please hear me. Becoming a better person does not get you to heaven. You get to heaven through Christ and his blood. But what happened was when I was placed up to God's light, I realized how far short I fell. Yeah. And I realized all the times I could have helped others and brought them to Christ and failed to do it.
When you feel his intense love, it makes you want to live differently.
It does. It makes you, and the closer you get to him, the more you know you need him.
Ultimately, how do you feel like this has changed you?
Well, I tell you, as I mentioned earlier, I used to wake up with a knot in my stomach. I wake up with peace and joy. And the other thing is, I began to realize, you know what? My career is not everything.
Yeah.
My God is.
Yes.
And it changes everything. You think differently, you feel different. Now, I love what I do. I've got an incredible firm that I've worked with. The people I'm with are just wonderful, loving people. And we love working together, and I still love what I do. But there's nothing sweeter than God's love.
Well, that's an amazing, powerful picture of God really dropping himself right into the middle of someone's life just to say, I love you.
Incredible.
Yeah. You know, we hear that over and over and over again, Jeff, that we can't imagine, that eye has not seen, ear has not heard what he's prepared, but also the deep love he has for us. Thank you for sharing your story with us today.